Europe, the Southeast. One kingdom, 3 rulers, their consorts, their heirs, and none of them destined to be happy. And the kingdom? The kingdom was doomed.
I was very young when I lost my father, and 3 years later we had to bid farewell to favorite places, to many people, some of which I never saw again. And I returned to my homeland after 50 years in exile.
This story is the missing page from the common European history book. It has never been told before. Europe was on the brink of fatal events in the 1870s. States that had disappeared centuries earlier rose like a phoenix from the ashes. Serbia, Greece, Bulgaria. The Ottoman Empire, which had kept them in check, was crumbling. Millions of Europeans looked upon these developments with hope and enthusiasm. They had no way of knowing that what lay ahead was 100 of the bloodiest, most dramatic years humankind. Europe was doomed to a series of catastrophes, but the cards had not yet been dealt. The entire aristocracy of the Old World was to be included in this game of Napoleonic solitaire. At the time, Europe was a land of monarchies. Monarchs were all related to one another to some degree, and maintained informal contacts. European royalty were bound together by ties of blood, friendship, rivalry, love. European states were governed by parallel structures, formally by their governments and informally by monarchical circles. In a way, those structures were the archetypal model of the European Union. The decision-making process was deeply flawed and led to an unbroken chain of tragic events.
Full fathom 5 thy father lies, of his bones are coral made. Those are pearls that were his eyes, nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. Sea nymphs hourly ring his knell, ding dong, hark! Now I hear them, ding dong, bell.
When did it all begin? At the end of the 7th century, the Byzantines lost a series of battles against the united armies of Slavs and Proto-Bulgarians who had recently begun to settle on the Balkan Peninsula. The peace treaty between the Eastern Roman Emperor Constantine IV Pogonat and the Proto-Bulgarian Tsar Asparuch was concluded in the year 681 after a war in Thrace and is commonly considered to mark the foundation of Bulgaria. 40 years later, the joint armies of Bulgarians and Byzantines won a decisive victory against the invading forces of the Arab Caliphate that had besieged Constantinople. The Christian army slaughtered 20,000 Arabs and saved the capital. But collision between the young Bulgarian state and the Byzantine Empire was inevitable. Though neighbors, they were not equal in stature. During the 8th century, Serdica was still an important Byzantine city. Bulgarian Tsar Krum, the rising star on the European political scene, had his sights on it. His military prowess made him into a worthy peer of his contemporary Charlemagne. At the time, the latter's Frankish Empire, Byzantium, and Bulgaria were the most powerful continental states. Bulgaria adopted Christianity in 863 from Constantinople, having turned away repeated papal offers from Rome to officiate. That decision was made by Bulgarian ruler Boris I. What the newly christened nation took from the Pope was the cross as a military symbol to adorn its battle standards with, as well as the battle cry, Deus Nobiscum, God with us. It was Constantine the Great who first adopted these. He sought to project the kingdom of heaven onto earth. Faith in God was expressed in the phrase, "The cross is victorious and is victor." Thus, there was no need to wait for the end of a battle in order to know who the winner would be. Centuries later, Germany, Britain, and Russia would also use the Deus Nobiscum motto. And finally, at the foundation of the Third Bulgarian state, Bulgarians too would return to their Byzantine heritage, which had had such an influential role in shaping contemporary European ideals. 11 centuries after the Christianization of Bulgaria by Tsar Boris Mikhail, another future Tsar bearing the name Boris would cause a rift between the Vatican and Eastern Orthodoxy, before he took the fatal step of baptizing him in both strains of Christianity. His father would utter, "God with us." At the outset of the 11th century, Bulgaria succumbed to Byzantine rule. Constantinople would retain control for 167 years. Then the Second Bulgarian Empire would rise from the ashes. Its capital was Turnovo, a hilly city surrounded by the meandering river Yantra. In 1185, brothers Asen and Peter used a local church, St. Demetrius, to proclaim the end of Byzantine rule and the rebirth of Bulgarian statehood. The city by the river grew to rule over a big and powerful kingdom. Oftentimes, people referred to Turnovo as the new Constantinople. The Tsarevets hilltop, where the royal palace sat, was the seat of political and ecclesiastical power. The hilltop was a mighty fortress enclosing a bustling court and sophisticated urban development. Bulgaria was once again, and for a long time, an important factor in determining the destiny of Europe. Her independent history lasted until the 15th century, when the entire Balkan Peninsula, Byzantium included, was overrun by the powerful, newly established Ottoman Empire. The green standard of Islam fell over the land like a final curtain. One tiny corner would retain the Orthodox faith and spirituality. Mount Athos, a peninsula abutting the Aegean Sea in present-day northern Greece. As early as the 10th century, Byzantium assisted in the setting up of a monastic community there. The task fell to a very distinguished monk, the future Saint Athanasius. In the 18th century, another monk, Paisi, resided in one of the monasteries there and wrote a book that traced the spiritual link between the Second and Third Bulgarian kingdoms more than 100 years before the latter was even founded. In the text titled Slav Bulgarian History, Paisi followed the fortunes of Bulgaria from its foundation in 681 to his own time. So began the Bulgarian national revival. Christians believed that the Virgin Mary, Mother of God, stopped by Mount Athos on her way to Cyprus, and hence they named the place the Holy Mountain. St. Petersburg, early spring in the imperial capital on the Neva River. It was still cold around the Bay of Finland. The Winter Palace was built during the 18th century in the Russian Baroque style. For many years, it was the main residence of the Russian emperors. The date was the 16th of April, 1842. This day would affect the fate of millions. The heir to the Russian throne, Alexander Nikolaevich, was to marry Marie von Hesse, daughter of the Grand Duke of Hesse-Darmstadt Ludwig II. She would adopt the name Maria Alexandrovna and become a member of the royal house that had already ruled Russia for 2 centuries. It was a royal wedding conducted by the highest standards of such occasions. The date was the 16th of April. The place, the Palace Church St. Saviour, Mandaluyong. It is the creation of 18th century Italian architect Francesco Bartolomeo Rastrelli. Services were usually attended by members of the imperial family, and accordingly, the interior is rather like the interior of a palace. Alexander's father and mother, Emperor Nicholas I, and his consort, Alexandra Fyodorovna, were in attendance, and so was a great multitude of European monarchs, aristocrats, and diplomats. Among them, the bride's brother, Prince Alexander von Hesse-Darmstadt. Here, in the Temple of God, under a dome bearing the likeness of Christ, a great love sparkled into existence that eventually resulted in the birth of 4 princes and a princess. Amongst them was Prince Alexander Battenberg, the first ruler of autonomous Bulgaria after centuries of foreign domination. No one in the church could even imagine that the bride's brother would fall for her lady-in-waiting, Julia von Hauke. But this uneven match would fail to impress the heir to the throne, Alexander. The court had other plans for his new relative. Julia and Alexander von Hesse were forced to leave the city of the Bronze Horsemen, as the poet Pushkin had once dubbed St. Petersburg. The scandal rocked the entire aristocratic class of Europe. Prince von Darmstadt and his beloved countess departed to a life of romance and hardship. They were to marry 10 long years after the Winter Palace royal wedding that brought them together. An objectionable affair became something far worse, an objectionable marriage. Disparity of rank is not tolerated by the merciless laws of noble matrimony. Their ceremony took place in Wrocław, the historic capital of Lower Silesia. There, by the exquisite Gothic town hall, the pair put a final seal on their love and their peers' disapproval. Indignation and forgiveness were still some time off, but they showed little sign of remorse. They simply moved on with their lives together.
I don't wish for more than your love. My generosity is deep like an ocean. The more love I give you, the more I have to give.
Alexander Joseph von Battenberg, fruit of the love between Alexander von Hesse and Julia von Hauke, was born in 1857. He drew his first breath in Verona, the city of Romeo and Juliet. Then part of the kingdom of Lombardy Venetia, under the Austro-Hungarian imperial crown. Little Alexander was taken for walks by the world's most famous balcony, that of the Capuletti family. At least, Verona urban legend would have it that way. The myth dates back to the 14th century and may or may not have a basis in fact, but the Gothic building gives the observer a good idea of how the rich lived in times gone by. The young prince and future Bulgarian ruler would inherit a penchant for illegitimate love as well. Some 20 years later, he would become the head of state of possibly the most problematic country in Europe. Before that, though, his parents would have to endure countless humiliations. But in the end, fate proved kind to the prodigal pair. One by one, their relatives and the rest of Europe's aristocracy welcomed them back into the fold. Alexander's brother, Ludwig II von Hesse-Darmstadt, elevated Julia Hauke to the rank of countess, and then, in 1858, to Princess von Battenberg. Her children were permitted to inherit this title, but not that of their father. Thus did the Battenberg family become a morganatic branch of the Grand Ducal family of Hesse-Darmstadt. Young Prince Alexander spent most of his childhood in Darmstadt. Later, the city would become the focal point of a new, rebellious art form, Jugendstil. The family seat was the Heiligenberg Palace. Finished in 1810, Heiligenberg became a favorite haunt of the most exalted European nobility. The Tsar of Russia and his family were frequent visitors. The crypt contained the tombs of the young prince's parents, the romantic runaways of Petersburg, Wrocław, and Verona, Alexander and Julia. Later, Alexander would receive strict training at the Dresden Military Academy, and with the permission of his uncle, the Russian Emperor, the very same one who had expelled his parents from St. Petersburg, would participate in the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878 with the rank of second lieutenant. He took part in decisive engagements at Shipka, Kazanluk, Stara, and Nova Zagora. And was awarded an Order of Valor. Russia saw newly liberated Bulgaria as its natural sphere of influence. The emperor already had in mind a ruler for the vacant seat of the young state, his nephew. Alexander was blissfully unaware of his august relative's intentions. April 1879, Turnovo, the newly created Bulgarian Principality. After a 500-year absence from the political scene, Bulgarians gathered for the first meeting of their Grand National Assembly. In constituting one, they were trying to emulate Europe. The Russian Empire was exercising constant pressure on the new entity. To the casual observer, it felt only natural that it would. A mere 12 months earlier, the Russians, assisted by local volunteer militias, had crushed and eliminated the centuries-old Ottoman Empire. Veliko Turnovo was the capital of the Second Bulgarian Empire between the 12th and 14th centuries. Protected by vertical cliffs and a rapidly flowing river, its fortifications were considered unbreachable. The local Turkish governor's palace was converted to a parliament. The building was designed and built in 1972 by a famous Bulgarian architect, Kolyo Fichito. The sloping terrain meant that the palace had 2 floors on the northern side and 4 on the southern. It was there that the delegates to the Grand National Assembly adopted a constitution and elected a prince. Many of those present were pivotal figures in modern Bulgarian history. Chief candidates for the throne were Prince Heinrich Reuss, the future Romanian King Carol, Valdemar, the son of the Danish King Karl IX, and several others. Competition was merciless. The great powers jostled for rank and influence and pulled no punches in attempting to gain favor for their men. The atmosphere was rife with intrigue, threats, even open war. In the end, Russia won. Bulgaria was pleased to welcome its first prince, Alexander von Battenberg, who was elected unanimously. Prince Battenberg had fought for the liberation of his domain. He had asked his uncle's special permission to do so. Apart from that, he had nothing to do with Bulgaria. Despite local enthusiasm, the Third Bulgarian Kingdom was still vassal to the Ottoman Empire. Modernity, however, was not going to wait on anyone to catch up. A year earlier, Englishman Edward Maybridge used 12 still cameras to create the first ever moving picture, the true beginning of cinema before the Lumiere brothers. Soon, cinema newsreels would become a powerful propaganda weapon, rivaling the printing press. One of the first duties of the young prince was to pay homage to Sultan Abdul Hamid in Istanbul. The audience was to take place at the Dolmabahce Palace on the European side of the Bosphorus. Vassal or not, the prince turned up on a white ship, dressed in a national military uniform and wearing a white cap. The audience was cool and followed protocol. This was no way for a vassal to pay homage to his nominal master. Soon the world press would dub Prince Battenberg Europe's favorite child. He was young, intelligent, educated, charming, and in the eyes of many noble women, good-looking. He was related to the ruling houses of Germany, Russia, and Britain. Just before noon, on the 24th of June, 1870, Battenberg and his retinue disembarked at Varna. People had not yet even set their eyes on him, but their enthusiasm for the first Bulgarian prince in 5 centuries was palpable. Throngs of ecstatic men and women lined the roads all the way from Varna to Veliko Turnovo and then Sofia. In Turnovo, he swore on the Constitution and had his first taste of local politics of a nation whose language, traditions, and mentality he was unfamiliar with. Alexander did, however, desire to elevate his new domain to a place of pride among European states. His ambition may have been a function of his youth. He was only 22, but his nation was already 1,200 years old. He then moved into another former Ottoman palace, this time in Sofia. It had just been converted to a royal palace for the needs of Alexander and was amongst the very first architectural symbols of the new capital. Prince Alexander arrived on horseback to inspect the Bulgarian army units waiting for him in formation. Nothing would be as it should for a young and handsome prince. After only a year, he and his court vacated the palace so that it could be fully refurbished. The old building had been hastily and shabbily converted to a European-style palace. The same rang true of the country as a whole. It was too unstable, too disorderly, and this on the brink of momentous and tragic times for Europe. In 1880, there was no bloodshed. The civilized world, too tired of fighting, busied itself with switching on the first electrical light bulb, lighting up city streets, setting up universities. The principality was beginning to settle into a more predictable governance routine. After their arrival, the Russians had begun to set up institutions of government. Those were initially attached to Russian military headquarters. The first to take shape was the civic chancery, tasked with transforming the old Ottoman ways of doing things and developing administrative capacity in tune with European practices. Another important function was to restore nationhood. Prominent men, most of them graduates of Russian universities, were invited to lend a hand. Among them towering figures such as Todor Burmov, Marin Drinov, Petko Kardavelov, they would leave a lasting imprint on the political and cultural life of the reborn country. A series of economic, historical, and ethnographic studies were published in 5 volumes under the title Materials for the Study of Bulgaria. The goal was to establish an empirical basis for better understanding of the nation's past, present, and future. The palace, the first representative structure in the European manner to be erected in the capital, was rebuilt in 2 stages by 2 rulers. In Prince Battenberg's time, it was entrusted to Central Europeans, who were responsible for the front. the ground floor containing administrative space, and above it the enfilade, a series of ballrooms connected to one another. The second stage, dated 1894 to 1896, saw the completion of the northeastern section containing the royal apartments, the library, study rooms, game rooms, a dining hall and reception, a special covered entrance for carriages, and 2 conservatories. Ferdinand claimed authorship of this transformation, which according to him turned the palace into the most refined and well-maintained residence in Europe. The total built-up area came to 25,000 square meters, divided into 60 rooms. The architectural style was Viennese Baroque, deftly mixed with Renaissance elements. As the young state gained strength, so did her ruler gain in confidence. The Council of Ministers and National Assembly laid down the legislative basis for further modernization. A national audit office came into being. A law was passed setting up a national bank. Building societies sprang into being with numerous shareholders to reflect the ever-quickening pace of development. The cityscape of major settlements such as Sofia and Varna reflected this. The prince was convinced Bulgaria needed more glamour. In 1880, he promoted the idea of turning Varna into a seaside capital, came to lay down the foundations, and stayed at the Greek monastery of St. Demetrius on the northern side of the Varna harbor. He liked the spot so much he chose to build a summer palace there. Negotiations began between the local authorities and the royal chancery for the monastery to be purchased and refashioned into an official summer residence for the prince. The municipal authorities decided to rename the territory Sandrovo after Alexander's pet name. Construction began on the 16th of August, 1882. Again, Baroque and Neo-Renaissance styles were in evidence, as well as the Romantic influence of classic French architecture. The palace would only be completed during the reign of Ferdinand. Alexander had few happy moments, and most of them were spent here. We walked along the shore for 40 minutes, then we came down to reach Sandro's estate. Down below was the dark azure sea, separated from us by vineyards and verdant orchards, punctuated here and there by presentable cottages. Hot and dusty, we reached the newly built palace, complete with tower and roof in the French style, overlooking the sea from its position atop a sizable incline. Unbelievable, here we were, on Europe's southeasternmost point. Thus wrote, of her first trip to Bulgaria, Alexander's sister, Maria von Battenberg.
Spirit.